Coming up, it's back to school time. We're visiting with a history teacher about how to best support Indigenous students. Plus, Native journalists are heading to Phoenix. And Johns Hopkins welcomes a new faculty member. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is a proud supporter of Indian Country Today. Students at Cronkite News and Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma cover Indigenous communities together. This important work is distributed by more than 100 news organizations. This collaboration provides a much-needed boost to coverage of Native American communities nationwide. Learn more at cronkitenews.azpbs.org.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. Support is building for a major federal law in Indian Country. As of Tuesday, over 20 amicus briefs have been filed by various stakeholders in support of the Indian Child Welfare Act. That 44-year-old law, which protects Native children, has the possibility of being overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. Dan Leverins, an assistant law professor at the University of North Dakota, breaks this down.
You see almost half of the U.S. states, 8 states for every one that the plaintiffs have. You see almost 500 federally recognized tribes and dozens of regional and national tribal organizations. So Indian Country is united in support of ICWA.
The Indian Child Welfare Act sets certain requirements during adoption proceedings, all in an effort to prevent Native children from being removed from their families and tribal communities. ICWA has been labeled the gold standard in child welfare policy around the country. The High Court is slated to hear arguments in Brackeen versus Holland in November. When that happens, it will likely be the first time Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson will hear a case involving federal Indian law since joining the Supreme Court.
She has very little experience with Indian law, and so it's hard for us to predict where she might come down on any specific issue.
Leverins added that he remains confident the court will affirm the constitutionality of ICWA. As November's midterm elections get closer and closer, Indigenous organizers are finding ways to reach voters. ICT's Karina Dominguez has the story.
Skaters are ready to exercise their voting rights after advocates turn to skate parks. In an effort to increase voter turnout among Native youth for the midterm elections, Protect the Sacred and Indian Collective hosted Skate to the Polls on the Navajo Nation.
Civic participation can be joyful, it can be fun. It is fun. We are proving it today at Skate to the Polls. The community showed up, and I'm so proud. They came to celebrate our power.
Advocates say many hurdles stand in the way of Indigenous voters, including infrequent polling places in post offices and limited internet access. Organizers say they want to engage Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and other historically overlooked communities to increase voter turnout.
I am reclaiming my power. I am reclaiming my land. I am reclaiming my power for my community, the Native American community, and the next 7 generations.
More events will take place leading up to the midterms in November, including a Skate to the Polls for students in Georgia, a quinceañera-inspired ride to the polls in trucks and limos for first-time Latina voters in Texas, and an Election Day horseback ride to the polls in Arizona. In Tucson, Arizona, Karina Dominguez, ICT News.
Now to California, where an art installation is highlighting a historic gathering of Indigenous leaders. The Broad Museum in Los Angeles is spotlighting 20 artists in a new exhibition called This Is Not America's Flag. One of the standout installations is Indian Congress by absolute citizen Wendy Red Star. In her work, she recreated the 1898 Indian Congress, which was a gathering of more than 500 representatives from 35 tribal nations in Omaha, Nebraska. The exhibition continues through September 25th. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, she's a history teacher and she's also my sister. Lorelei Chavez gets us ready for back to school time. But first, a well-known medical doctor heads east for a new gig. We'll be right back. A leader in Indigenous medicine is headed to Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Dawn Warren will serve as the Provost Fellow for Indigenous Policy and co-director for the Center for American Indian Health. Welcome, Dr. Warren, and congratulations to you.
Thank you so much. Very glad to be here.
So you've really built up the InMed program at the University of North Dakota. Tell us what this move means for you and your career.
Yeah, at the University of North Dakota, I've been very blessed to be able to lead the Indians into Medicine, or InMed program, as well as develop several new programs. So at UND, we have InMed, which has been around for nearly 50 years, and we've now graduated over 260 American Indian Alaska Native physicians. And we have a relatively new PhD in Indigenous health, and that has 50 students in the first 3 cohorts of students. So a lot of good work at UND. And I'm very excited about the opportunities at Johns Hopkins. For me personally and professionally, it's an opportunity to build upon this work, but also to look at the doctorate in public health and how we might link Indigenous health principles to that curriculum, but also develop international Indigenous health research and educational programming.
What about Johns Hopkins University stood out to you?
Well, Johns Hopkins is very well known, particularly in public health. The Bloomberg School of Public Health is the #1 ranked public health school in the nation, and really it's a leader in the world. And the Center for American Indian Health has been in place for over 30 years, housed at Johns Hopkins, and they've done a lot of work with Southwestern tribes and really across the nation. They've engaged over 200 tribes in various types of programs. So they're well respected nationally and internationally, but they're also doing good work in Indian country. So I'm excited to join as co-director of the center and expanding our work both in the US and abroad.
Absolutely. I mean, you're also going to be the Provost Fellow of the Indigenous Health Program. I think sometimes academia and titles in particular are kind of up in the air, but tell us exactly what that means for you.
Yeah, so within the Provost office at Johns Hopkins, they have what's called the Provost Fellows program, and it's to build out a specialty area within academics. So my role will be to expand Indigenous health policy. And what's exciting is that Johns Hopkins also has a new building right on Capitol Hill. So that will be opening up in the fall of 2023. So I'll have an office both in Baltimore with the School of Public Health, but also in Washington, D.C., focused on policy issues. And there's so much work to be done with policy and legislation to improve Indigenous health. So it'll be wonderful to have a front row seat, so to speak, in working on these issues in a very meaningful way.
I mean, when you're talking about public health for Native people, there's so much to talk about. But if you were choosing one or maybe 2 topics that are the most pressing, what would you say?
Yeah, there are so many issues. If we look at the U.S., I think the under-resourcing of Indian health service has been a longstanding issue. The current administration has done a good job of trying to increase resources for Indian health service and related programs, but we're still terribly underfunded, particularly when you look at the needs in Indian country for health services. So that's one of the biggest issues, is just making sure we have adequate resources and that the federal government lives up to its treaty obligation to provide health services for our people. Other issues include the ability to respond to public health crises, whether it's COVID or monkeypox, or even looking at chronic disease, and how we still haven't gotten adequate control over things like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. We still see disparities there. So we have a lot of work to do on the policy front for resources, but also on the programmatic front to prevent chronic disease.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned COVID because that is still a big topic for so many of us. For COVID in particular, what are your thoughts on where we're at right now in Indian country?
Well, we're seeing some major improvements, and just actually I'm very proud of what's happened through Johns Hopkins. They've actually taken the lead on assisting several tribes, including in Arizona with Navajo Nation, on trying to assist and provide technical guidance on the COVID-19 response. So that's an arena where we see a mixed bag. Some communities are doing very well with their response, and we're seeing good public health measures to prevent ongoing spread. However, some populations are also still suffering the consequences and the disparities related to COVID-19. So we haven't fully controlled COVID-19 nationally, and certainly in Indian country, there are some of our communities that are still devastated by this disease.
Absolutely. We only have about a minute left here, but I want to ask you about what you've heard from Native doctors, physicians, nurses about how they're feeling at this point in the pandemic. I think nationally we hear that a lot of people in the medical field are very tired, but what are you hearing anecdotally?
I'm hearing the same thing. I think a lot of our providers are feeling tired and exhausted from all of the work related to the COVID-19 response. But in addition to that, I think all of the misinformation that's out there, I think all of the politically motivated disinformation that's out there also puts us in a position where we feel like the profession is sometimes under attack, unfairly and unnecessarily. And it really is unsettling to see how politics have had such a huge impact on public health response and even the public's perspective of public health. Our system in the US is really among the best in the world when it comes to public health response. But I think a lot of the misinformation that's out there has kind of tainted the image of the work that we do. So there's both physical and mental exhaustion, but there's also disappointment in the politics around it.
Well, Dr. Don Warren, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Nearly 40 years ago, a handful of Native journalists formed the Native American Press Association. In those days, they mostly worked for tribal newspapers. Today, the organization has evolved into the Native American Journalists Association. It serves Indigenous journalists in all forms of media, including print, digital, television, radio, and more. This week, NAJA will meet in person for the first time since before the pandemic started. ICT's editor Jordan Bennett-Begay serves on the NAJA board, and she joins us now to talk about the conference. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, Leah. Thanks for having me.
So we have you here in studio in Phoenix. Welcome to Phoenix, by the way. We're so excited. Tell our viewers why you're here.
I'm here just, it's all about NAJA this week. We have, this is the first time we're meeting in 3 years. And so I think everyone's excited. I know the board's excited. We've been planning this and just, watching the COVID protocols change and, deciding whether we should have it on or not in person. Because I think the first year, from what I remember, is 2020 was when it was virtual. And now we're just really excited to see everyone and to also meet funders, recruits, students, and professors.
Absolutely. I mean, COVID is still the backdrop to so much of our life. Maybe talk about what kinds of COVID protocols are going to be in place for this gathering.
Sure. So for all the registrants had to provide vaccine verification. If they didn't, they would have to provide a negative COVID test the day before, the day of. And then also, NAJA is encouraging all conference attendees to wear masks.
I'm so excited. I feel like all of us Indigenous journalists haven't been together, as you mentioned, since 2019. For people who are maybe learning about this conference for the first time, tell them what exactly you can find at a NAJA conference.
Sure. So NAJA is pretty much, it's a National Native Media Conference, and all sorts of journalists there are, Native and non-Native, or Indigenous, non-Indigenous, are there just to, build connections, network, talk about future projects, and also just to build their skill set. There's tons of panels going on now. One I know a lot of people are excited for is the film screening of Prey from Hulu, and the producer Jay Myers will be there for a Q&A, so that'll be really exciting. And there's some workshops on investigative skill sets. There's climate change panels, COVID panels. It's just a place where all journalists can figure out how they can better cover Indigenous communities.
And another big part of the conference is to help train that next generation of Indigenous journalists. Tell us how, you all plan to do that.
Sure. So this year, I'm the director of the Native American Journalism Fellowship. I'm an alum, so it kind of is very fitting, and I love education and students. So this year, we kind of restructured the fellowship so that students were able to go in person and attend the conference and network. Because all of it is about, providing job opportunities and bringing them closer to potential employers. In the years previous, it used to be a 1-week intense student newsroom, so they would cover a story or two. But from my experience and other alumni's experience, we thought, hey, let's just try something different and allow them to attend the conference and be part of those conversations. Because, students, when they go back to universities, I always say they're often talking to a wall about important issues. Like if they want to talk about MMIW or Indian Child Welfare Act, that, in these mainly predominantly white institutions, there's nobody to talk to about that, or very little people who can understand those issues.
And you actually have a personal connection to this fellowship. I understand it's part of the reason why you became a journalist to begin with.
Yeah, it is. I'm surprised you remember that. Yes, it is. No, it is. This was I was really going to public health school or journalism school, and this fellowship changed my mind. I thought, this is for me. This is where I belong. And I'm now trying to give back and also guide students down their career paths, wherever it may go.
Maybe talk about for ICT. I mean, all of us are Indigenous journalists, so this is the most exciting thing we look forward to all year. But for ICT, what are we sort of planning in terms of our staff going, or maybe tell us about that?
Sure. I know this is really exciting now that we're in Phoenix, because Phoenix is where our headquarters is, our mothership. And I know a lot of us work remotely, so we're really excited to see the studio and see how the broadcast works. And just to be together, also see each other all the time on Zoom and on screens and phone calls, and keep in touch on social media. But now we get to hang out in person. And we're also throwing a public meet and greet just so we can meet community members, tribal leaders, or just people to see. I want people to see all of our bylines. Match our faces of bylines, excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you write for digital, on television, they see our face all the time. But when you write for digital, it's like, oh, this is where this person comes from. And this is, a little bit more about their story. I want to actually talk about how far Indigenous journalists are traveling to get to Phoenix. Tell us about what you know.
Right now, I know that Canada is probably the furthest, but I'm probably wrong about that. I'm pretty sure. NAJA has over, I think, 900 members from all over the country, and also in Canada. And so part of NAJA's goal is also to try to bridge that gap of Canada and the US, because that's technically how NAJA started. There were Canadian Indigenous journalists and Indigenous journalists in the US who created NAJA. So we're trying to, just build that relationship and figure out how we can collaborate more, because I think, collaboration is how we get further.
Absolutely. And again, the Native American Journalists Association Conference is going to be Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and we're really excited. Jordan, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
And we'll be right back. It's that time of year where Indigenous children are heading back to school. That's true for educators, too. I had a virtual conversation with my sister, Lorelei Chavez, yesterday. She's a history teacher at Santo Domingo Pueblo Elementary and Middle School in New Mexico. Take a look.
Hey, everybody. Lori Chavez here from Kiwa Pueblo. Here at Santo Domingo School, I teach middle school history, and I also run the Indigenous Education Initiative grant, which is bringing Indigenous experiences to our school.
Students are heading back to school everywhere. When you're seeing students in the hallway or in the lunchroom, what are they telling you about how they're feeling to be back at school?
Funny enough, we did do an activity where we shared a SEL activity, and everyone had to share a little bit of feelings of their first day. I heard things from excited, nervous, lost. A girl who came back from virtual learning last year and who is now here back in person, is feeling a little lost on the first day. So it's kind of cool. We have students coming back from last year who came back in person, and some students who are coming back from virtual learning. So it's really finding where they're meeting in the middle.
A lot of our viewers are hearing about this school for the first time, and you mainly teach Indigenous students. Maybe tell us about the makeup of your classroom and how you empower your Indigenous students to be proud of themselves and where they come from.
So the biggest thing at Santo Domingo School is we are a 99% Indigenous school within a public school. This is very unique because you don't normally find 100% Indigenous schools within public school districts. We also are on native land. Our school building is housed on the Kiwa Pueblo. So that's another amazing partnership that a non-native public school district makes a partnership with our Indigenous community. How I empower my students is when they come into their classroom, the biggest thing I can do is be a face from their community. I speak their language. I greet them in our Indigenous greetings. As they come into our classroom, in my history classroom, the biggest thing I want to do is indigenize their learning. So how am I giving opportunities for them to see themselves in stories, in media, in history books, and things of that nature?
Actually talk more about that because history is something that we talk about so often on our newscast and how it's taught and what kinds of topics are taught. What do you teach and what do you ultimately hope that your students take away?
So this year I'm teaching middle school history. We do teach world history, US history, and New Mexico history. In all those aspects, as we all know, the Indigenous narrative isn't on the forefront of our textbooks or even our history media that we're learning. So as an Indigenous teacher, it's my duty and my actually excitement to bring different experiences, different stories of different tribes, different historians, women historians, Indigenous history makers, and people who weren't normally sought out to tell the history of America. We also know that the Indigenous narrative isn't always included. So really having an opportunity to share stories from different tribes, not only in America, but across the world.
And is that something that you're finding that your students want to learn about?
Yeah, it's interesting enough, our state is actually moving toward indigenizing education through a lawsuit called Yazzie versus Martinez. But prior to that, at our school in Santo Domingo, our kids have been craving and needing Indigenous experiences from since I remember. I walked through this hallways as a young girl, and I always wanted to see a Native principal at my school. And so we're on our way. We have a couple, actually more than 5 Native teachers here on campus. We're starting to see the change of Indigenous education in New Mexico, not only seeing faces who look like them, but histories and stories included in the curriculum that they're learning.
One of the parts that I really want our viewers to learn more about is what you allow your students to call you. So I understand they actually have the option of calling you a few different things. Maybe tell us what that is and why you do that and why you do that intentionally.
So in my school, I give the kids or my students the option to call me 3 things. They can call me Miss Chavez, of course. The second name they can call me is Kuwayats, which is my Indigenous name. And then my third name, I go by Auntie Lori in the school. And the reason why I call myself Auntie Lori, or the students call me Auntie Lori, is we're practicing kinship. We're practicing this idea that even though I am a teacher in the school, an elder of theirs, I am still of that age of being an auntie. So regardless of whether I'm non-native or native, I can fill that auntie role for them in the school. So it's really cool. I walk down the hallway in kindergarten, even though I'm a middle school teacher, and I hear Auntie Lori, and I turn around and it's a student who's not even related to me, but they still honor that kinship. So it's really cool and awesome to kind of create that experience in my school.
Absolutely. Well, we only have a short time left here, but I want to actually talk about the other Indigenous educators who watch this newscast and are maybe listening to this interview. I understand that, back to school time comes with a mix of emotions, and especially going through a pandemic, not everyone is as excited as they would be before the pandemic. So maybe if you were talking to Indigenous educator who needed some advice or a pick-me-up, what would you say to them?
I would tell to my indigenous educators across Indian country, it's really important to honor the way your students are coming to us. A lot of them have gone through loss, a lot of them have gone through hardship, and a lot of them have been needing our connection and our support that we offer to our students throughout the school year. So I encourage you to share love. I encourage you to be honest and truthful with your students on the hard days. Even when you're having a hard day, it's okay to tell your students that you're struggling too, because it's important to make those connections. And lastly, I want to remind you to take care of yourselves. Pour back into your cups emotionally, spiritually, whatever you can do to heal and take care of yourselves so that you can show up the next day and be that amazing teacher you can be for your students.
Well, Lori Chavez, a middle school teacher at Santo Domingo School, thank you so much.
I appreciate you too. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for having me.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.